Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll share some ideas with you for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. I'll be happy to field any questions or comments or contributions that you may have. And then it was suggested that perhaps we do a little guided meditation together to get all of you levitating. So yeah, hopefully we'll have a good time in the next hour, and it'll be rewarding for you. So the mind, let's begin with the mind actually before I give you questions. The mind, as we all know, as probably you know better than me, is something which is at the top of the agenda for medical professionals. We're seeing that it's becoming the perhaps biggest talking point in modern day medicine. And ironically, it's probably the thing which we feel we know least about.
That was a little too
Wow.
Is it better?
Get the ambient on this, right? Yeah, it's something which perhaps we feel like we know so little about. The initial title I've given for the talk is the mind, the modern day UFO, because it almost feels like that. It's a flying object. It always seems to be there, haunting us in some way, shape, or form. But oftentimes we don't really know how to identify it or how to deal with it. And that's where spiritual traditions are really, really powerful, because they begin to bring in a higher dimensional, or should I say another dimensional wisdom, which perhaps gives us insight into how to deal with the mind. So they say the mind creates reality, and the mind also translates reality. That's why we often have this saying in the world, it's all in the mind. Because the mind creates reality. Whatever is kind of circling up here eventually manifests into our words, our actions, our goals, our aspirations, and our interactions with the world. And then once we create things with all of those interactions, we're left with something in front of us. And then according to our mental state, we then begin to decode it and translate it. And then it makes us feel a certain way. And then we begin thinking, wow, if the mind creates reality and translates reality, how much attention I should be putting into my own mental wellness. And ironically, that's probably the thing which is neglected the most in the world today. So I'm just going to give you guys a few questions, and this is a little mental health check for all of you, and see how you do. The questions are pretty simple. And you may want to just mentally note the questions which perhaps you score a little bit lower on, because they may also give you some insights into things that need to change. But I'm going to give you a series of statements here, and if you feel it really applies to you, it's a 5. And if you feel it really doesn't apply to you, it's a 0. And anything between that is just a scale. And then we can have a number at the end out of 50. I'm generally very present and alert on the task at hand. Of course, with these questions, we're always in having good days and bad days. But how much do you feel that you are able to give your intention, your attention, your kind of full cognitive capacity to any given thing that you're doing, especially the important things and the things you're meant to be focusing on at that time? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I don't get distracted by the urge to check social media and mobile notifications. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you think this hijacks your mind? Yeah, you've got some confessions coming out. While surfing the web, I'm good at staying focused on what I'm actually there for. How much do we tend to get deviated, get distracted, get somewhat derailed from our train of thought? Pretty simple questions, but sometimes very telling. I'm reasonably decisive in decision making, and once I have made up a decision, then I'm usually quite good at sticking to it and just accepting it. How much do we struggle to make a decision, and how much are we constantly looking back and either regretting or reanalyzing decisions that we've made? I'm in control of my desires and don't usually get tempted by external factors. How much do we have control over what kind of lights up in our consciousness? How much do we find that things that we don't really want to pursue, or things that we never meant to pursue, almost all of a sudden, instantaneously become really prominent within our consciousness? So far, you should have a number out of 25. When I'm with others, I'm able to give my full attention. How much do you feel you're present in conversations and interactions? They say attention is the rarest and most beautiful gift you can actually give people. It's just your presence in an interaction. I have the mental energy and strength to be creative. Now moving out of what you're doing day to day, how much mental strength do you have, mental wellness do you have to just think out of the box, to be creative, to challenge the way you're doing things, to think about different ways in which you could be doing things? Or do you find very fatigued? I pause before I react to provoking situations. This is also another very, very telltale state of our mind. How much we're able to be in control of instinctive and impulsive reactions to situations. 9, I'm able to stay calm even under stressful and pressurized situations. When the heat rises, when unexpected things happen, when it doesn't seem to be going to plan, how much am I displaced in my consciousness by that? And how much am I able to accept it and think logically about the way forward? And finally, when something upsets you, can you still move on without constantly thinking about it? Turn up to work and someone looks at you a little bit funny. So how much are you able to just leave things behind and just kind of be like, okay, it happened, let me just move on, I'll deal with it? And how much does it tend to overshadow and overwhelm us? Right? So you should have a number out of 50. And you don't need to tell us your number, can if you want to. But generally we say sometimes people's mind is in order, sometimes people's minds are on the border, and sometimes people's minds are out of order. And it's the interesting thing I want to share with you, and just, you can keep a mental note of some of these and maybe rewatch this later. But one important thing that the Eastern teachers talk about the mind is that the mind can be molded, and that the mind is actually in a constant state of flux in terms of its wellness. And therefore, instead of talking about mental health in the sense of you have a healthy mind or you have an unhealthy mind, we can talk about mental fitness in terms of it's a continuum, just like your physical health. You can have really good physical health, but if you neglect it, it can slide. And if you have really bad health, you can go on a regime and you can change it. And your physical health can be in a constant flux according to how much attention and energy you put to it. And that really helps us when we think about mental health, because it helps us to realize the more I put energy and emphasis and attention into it, I can change it. it can actually transform. And therefore, if you think about it on a continuum, there are certain things which can help us to understand how we're doing along the continuum. Mental weakness is where we tend to slip into comparison, criticism, complaining. But mental wellness, mental strength is where we're able to be compassionate, we're able to collaborate, we don't see ourselves, we don't feel insecure in the midst of others or in the face of other people's achievements, or we don't see ourselves as pitched against anyone. Mental weakness is kind of characterized by a short-term gratification, whereas mental wellness and a strong mind always has the ability to focus on the long term. The weak mind tends to be distracted and many branched, whereas the strong mind is attentive, focused, almost like that laser beam, which can just penetrate through anything. Mental weakness tends to be a mind and a kind of way of thinking that's controlled by fear, whereas mental strength is a state of mind that's inspired by dreams. Nelson Mandela once said, do your decisions in life, are they reflective of your fears, or are they reflective of your dreams? Oftentimes, the way we make decisions in the world is often based on what could go wrong. And we tend to make very defensive decisions. But what about if we would make decisions based on getting excited about what could go right? That doesn't mean we're oblivious to the dangers, but it means we're guided by a positive vision of the future. The weak mind overthinks and procrastinates, and the strong mind analyzes and articulates. And the weak mind tends to be rigid and attached, so that it has a very, very definite plan of how it thinks things should kind of play out in life. But life is unpredictable, and therefore the strong mind is able to react to the ever-changing world, changes which are unstoppable, unpredictable, uncontrollable. This is why investing time in mental health and understanding the mind and having insight into the workings of the mind is such valuable wisdom that everyone can and should have, because this really is what is going to drive the trajectory of the happiness that we feel in our journey through the world. And so in ancient spiritual literature, so much is talked about in terms of nurturing habits which will craft a beautiful mind. And what I'll try to do in the next 10-15 minutes before I open it up is just share with you 5 very, very powerful concepts which are given in the ancient wisdom traditions of the East of how to actually culture a beautiful mind. And they're 5 Sanskrit words, and how you apply them and how you incorporate them will be very, very individual, but these stand as universal pillars of mental wellness. And the first one is tapa, or austerity. Tapa, this is based on a Sanskrit root which literally means to heat, to illuminate, in more severe situations to burn. And the word tapa means almost a difficulty, a voluntary difficulty that one takes up without being asked, without being induced, something that one willfully chooses in order to achieve something greater in the long term. And so the kind of saying shouts out at us, don't give up what you want most for what feels good now. In other words, the people who live the most progressive and powerful lives are the people who don't listen to their loudest desires, but rather they listen to their deepest desires. And that's really a training that one can go through. Some people think, again, that this is just something that some people have and other people don't. but it can actually be trained. And so much of Eastern spiritual culture was taking on voluntary austerity, even in small ways. For example, a practice that many of you will be familiar with is fasting. And fasting almost, of course, it works on many, many levels. But one of the ideas of fasting is that it builds up mental strength, where one is able to forego an immediate, impulsive kind of desire in place of something greater that they're trying to achieve. And just by doing something like fasting and taking on a voluntary austerity like that, it builds a certain type of mental strength that then goes on to help in every other kind of facet of life. And so we're living in a world today where the talk of the town is the cost of living. But whenever someone brings this up, I say what we're dealing with is not the cost of living crisis. What we're dealing with in the world is the cost of existing crisis. Because the cost of existing is housing, travel, food, clothes, and fuel. But what I tell people is the cost of living is actually much bigger than a number. The cost of living is that you have to be ready to take a risk. And that means you have to give up comfort. The cost of living is that you've got to be disciplined. And that means we have to give up our own lethargy, our own laziness. The cost of living is that we need to take guidance and mentorship and coaching and be molded by those who can see our lives in much broader ways. And that means we have to give up the pride of thinking we know it. The cost of living is to be ready to face opposition and to give up the desire to conform and fit in with everyone and everything. And the cost of living is to be ready and totally okay with failing. And that means we have to give up the fear of being judged by others. So it's very interesting. The cost of living is something much bigger than a number. And so one of the first principles that the ancient sages tell us is that the most progressive life, the most powerful minds are those who in their life voluntarily take on tapa or austerity. Because if we learn this art of not giving up what we want most for what feels good now, life transforms. The second principle that the ancient teachers talk about is sattva. Sattva literally means goodness. It's a quality and an energy which one can incorporate into their life, which brings balance, which brings harmony. All of these words here, creativity, serenity. The Bhagavad Gita, an ancient Sanskrit work, mentions that there are actually three energies which are pervading the world we live in. In Sanskrit, they're known as sattva, rajas, and tamas, or goodness, passion, and ignorance. And these, I'll come back to this, these energies are actually existing all around us, and they simultaneously exist within us. So what is explained is that the food that you eat, the environment that you're surrounded by, the time of the day that you're functioning in, the people who surround you, all of these things are in one of these three energies, or a combination of these three energies. And according to what you surround yourself with, that will then create the modes within yourself as well. So your own faith, your own faith, your own determination, your own desires, what you devote yourself to. And so the idea of sattva is to create the right lifestyle, create the positive energy around you, when we, instead of, it's almost like when you go into a river, if you start trying to swim against the current, you're going to get tired very, very quickly. But when you synergize and synchronize yourself with the current, then what happens is it almost becomes so much more effortless. So when we understand the energies around us, and when we try to synergize ourselves with sattva, and the ancient teachers explain how you can identify that energy and inculcate those habits and lifestyle, then what we'll actually find is that we have a lot more mental strength. But when we surround ourselves with passionate energies, and when we surround ourselves with ignorant energies, then what happens is our mental state becomes again very, very weak. We go back into short-term gratification, comparing, criticizing, complaining, all of those things that we talked about. So the second very, very important habit is sattva. The third very, very important part of culturing a beautiful mind, according to spiritual teachers, is vidya. Vidya is a Sanskrit word which comes from the root vid. This is kind of where the English word wisdom comes from. And it literally means knowledge, understanding, insight, and wisdom, which allows us to kind of map reality. And so the idea of the spiritual teachers was that we don't see the world as it is, but rather we see the world as we are. In other words, each of us are seeing the same thing, but we're seeing something very, very different because we have a certain worldview. And so what knowledge does is it upgrades and uplifts our worldview. Vidya gives something called darshan. This is another Sanskrit word. This is literally where the English word worldview comes from. So each one of us have a darshan, because viewing extends beyond just the physical act of what we see. But viewing means, how do we intuitively comprehend and digest and understand the reality around us? Each one of us have a darshan. You know, there's that famous anecdote of two kids who were born to an alcoholic father. And one of them became an alcoholic, and the other one didn't touch one drop of alcohol. So they went to the son who became an alcoholic and said, "Why did you become an alcoholic?" And he said, "My whole life, I watched my alcoholic father." And they went to the son who didn't touch one drop of alcohol and said, "Why did you go this way?" He said, "My whole life, I watched my alcoholic father." That means the darshan was different. And so our darshan, or our worldview, psychology tells us, is made up of our nature and our nurture. By nature, we come into this world with a certain psychophysical disposition. And then as we grow up, we interact with people, with environments, with events, experiences, and emotions, and that further molds us. And therefore, we are who we are. We see the world, how we see the world, because of nature and nurture, because of our condition, and because of our interaction. But according to spiritual culture, there's something else which can actually supersede these things and actually change the way we look at life. And that is connection, connection to spiritual wisdom, connection to higher dimensional truths, connection to what we call in Sanskrit, vidya. And so the more that one grasps spiritual knowledge, their mental state then also becomes molded by that wisdom. The fourth very interesting concept that's given by the ancient teachers to culture a beautiful mind is seva, or selflessness. Seva means to serve others, to do something specifically in which one receives no benefit or selfish gain themselves. This was very, very much a part of how spiritual cultures would for spiritual communities would run, where seva would be such an important part. One reason why our mental state gets so hijacked and into such a negative mentality, almost ironically, is because we keep thinking about ourselves. And so it's said that we earn a living by what we get, but we create a life by what we give. And so selfless acts of kindness, charity in which one gets no recognition or one gets no personal gain, when we actually give to others, there's a law of giving. When we help others with their problems, there's a sense in which our own problems disappear. When we bring out the best, when we're really thinking of others, the German writer Goethe said, treat a person as they are, and they'll remain as they are. But treat them as they can and should be, and they'll become what they can and should be. And so when we actually focus on that, bringing out the best in others, our own personality flourishes. When we share wisdom with others, whenever we grasp something that's helped us, that has nourished us, and then we genuinely try to share that with others in a bid to do well for them, then we find our own wisdom and intelligence expands. And the bottom line is that when we share happiness with others, our own happiness increases as well. And so this concept of seva, service or selfless acts in which one gains no benefit themselves, also cultures a very beautiful mind. And the final one I'll give you today, which is becoming increasingly practiced in the world today, is mantra. We all are familiar with meditation and how meditational practices help us to focus the mind. And mantra is a specific type of meditation on sound. Mana means the mind, and tra comes from the Sanskrit word trayate, which means to free. And so the idea is that the world moves from subtle to gross, and sound is the foundation. Even we find in the Christian tradition the famous statement, in the beginning there was the Word was God. This idea that there is divine sound, divine vibration, which is the beginning. And we see, even in our general things, it all begins with sound. Relationships begin with sound. Our dreams and our desires begin by vocalizing them. And so in the same way, sound is actually said to actually culture a very, very powerful mindset, because it said that what spiritual sound does is it helps us to actually realize that we're not our mind. So according to the ancient Sanskrit Bhagavad Gita, we're not actually our mind. The mind is actually just the software that we're using. And by mantra, by sound vibration, we actually come to an awareness that the mind is just coming up with options, and I don't have to follow it. I don't have to always take it so seriously. I am separate from my mind, and I mold my mind. And this is one of the biggest problems in the world, that people can't distinguish themselves from their mind. So we do this every morning, mantra, we chant ancient prayers. And it's said that just like, for example, if I would play one of your favorite songs from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and as soon as you hear the song, so many memories come back, so many thoughts, feelings, emotions from that time in your life. In the same way, the mantra almost awakens an intuitive understanding of who we are, separate from this mind, and helps us to become observers of the mind rather than identify with the mind. And so these are very, very powerful insights into how we can culture a beautiful mindset. Because if you just rewind back to that table, our mental state is a continuum from mental weakness to mental wellness. And where we are on that continuum, on every single one of those rows, will depend, according to the ancient teachers, very much on how much we engage in practices like this, which are very, very powerful in terms of uplifting our mental state. And so I thought to come today and to just kind of give you some of these insights, which are alternative understandings of how to improve our mind and our mental health. I hope some of it was useful, some of it resonated with you. And yes, thank you very much. So it's 12:40, so I think we have another 15 minutes or so. I will do a meditation, but just to see whether you have any questions or whether there's anything I mentioned that you'd like to kind of inquire further about. Happy to take any feedback if anyone would like to ask me. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the presentation. You know, in the last slide, that you had the 5 words, you know, and Vidya is at the center. You know, sometimes I wonder, also, Sattva should be at the center, maybe they vote in. If you can talk a little bit about
Yeah. Actually, I didn't consciously put it like that. I was just trying to fit it into the slides. Yeah, I think at different times in our lives, different things take prominence. What ancient wisdom traditions do is they give us a toolkit. And at different times in our lives, we may engage and focus and emphasize different things. Vidya tends to be the foundation. That's why even in life, we go to school first, because everything begins with education and knowledge, and that builds the foundation for other things. And so in one sense, Vidya should be at the center, because that's what helps us to map our kind of life and journey forward. But yeah, you're totally right. At different times in our lives, we may have to invest, and we may decide to focus more on certain things than others. And so I think it's a very individual journey, and we all come also, our mental states. Each of us have parts of our mental state that is very strong, and each of us have parts of our mental state that are weaker. And so when we strategically see these tools, then some of these tools can help to deal with certain weaknesses that we have. And so we can almost employ different things for different purposes. Yeah.
You know, a lot of us are health professionals, and in medicine, we're a very fear-driven society. We pay for insurance for fear of getting sick. We pay for disability insurance with physicians for fear of getting sick. And so, how would you suggest to kind of put one foot in practicing the mindfulness and then putting one foot in, you know, being a
Being practical. Oh,
in the practical?
yeah. So we're living in a world where we have to be practical. There are certain things that we have to do in order to kind of preserve our journey going forward. And at the same time, realizing that we're not in control, and that we just have to step back and let things be, and not be constantly overshadowed by fear. Fear is an interesting thing, because if I asked you, do you have a fear now that you didn't have 10 years ago? We'd all put our hands up. Did you have a fear 10 years ago that you don't have now? We'd put our hands up. Do you have a fear that the person sitting next to you doesn't have? Probably. And do they have a fear that you don't have? Probably. all of that tells us that fear is learned. Fear is actually learned. It's not inherent within us. And the proof is it continues to change. And so the idea of spiritual culture is to understand, well, what the Bhagavad Gita actually talks about is something called detached work. And this is what actually brings fearlessness. The idea that what we do is in the world, we go out and we make the best effort we can. And once we've done the best we can, once we've invested our intention, our attention, and our actions in trying to do the best we can in any given sphere of activity, then what the Bhagavad Gita says, you've invested the entirety of what you can, and that's already your success. And therefore, after you've done that, you have the full freedom to step back and say now, whatever will be, will be. Of course, a lot of this is connected to the idea of a divinity, that there's a compassionate divinity which is overlooking everything and ultimately reciprocating with your endeavor. And so, real fearlessness, the ancient Bhagavad Gita tells us, comes from doing the best you can, investing your capacities and your energy, and then after that, stepping back, knowing that there are higher forces which are kind of conspiring as to what happens in your life, and those forces are ultimately benevolent and compassionate, and therefore whatever materializes from your best effort is always for the best. And that is quite difficult to accept unless one has this kind of belief in a divinity or some kind of higher power. But that's really where the ancient teachers explain fearlessness comes from. Yeah.
So I'm assuming for us to do all the things that are there on that slide, the discipline is the force which makes us do this, right?
Yeah.
And so what most people do in terms of cultivating discipline or getting more work done is they do some sort of negative self-talk in some sense, like they would be fear-based. If I don't do this, I will face public. Are there other ways to motivate yourself to cultivate discipline?
Yeah. So generally in the world today, we cultivate discipline by scaring ourselves into doing it. The panic monster has been tried. If you don't do it, it's interesting. That's why we procrastinate. Like we kind of procrastinate, and only when it becomes like a panic within us do we end up doing something. And so this is how most people motivate themselves. So the idea of vidya is that vidya is meant to be inspirational. Vidya is meant to empower us with a vision of what our life can and should be. Vidya is meant to instill within us a very, very deep why. You see, in the world, there are different questions you can ask. Why, how, what? And what most of the world does is they focus on the question, how and what. And if how and what is not comfortable to them or not convenient to them, they're kind of like, well, I won't do it then. But if people start with why, that's like famous Simon Sinek wrote the book, Start with Why. Because if your why is deep enough, then it doesn't matter how hard the how and the what is, one will embrace it. Therefore, they say the best alarm clock in the world is purpose. Because when your eyes open in the morning, if you have a purpose, you jump out of it. And so, Vidya gives us that purpose. Vidya helps us to identify that North Star. Vidya gives you a why that is so captivating that you're ready to do anyhow and what. And so fearless people, it's not that they don't have fears. It's just that their purpose is so amazing that their fears pale into insignificance. And it's the same for discipline. It's not that disciplined people somehow have some inherent superpower by which they're able to just be so committed and regulated. Generally, disciplined people are just disciplined because they're trying to achieve something amazing. And it's like, why would I not do whatever it takes to achieve it? Therefore, if your why is deep enough, you can deal with any how and what, no matter how difficult it is.
If somebody is driven by someone, and because of their ignorance, they feel happy about it, whatever they do, using, practicing those things which are set about the someone. What is the reason for them to be effective?
Yeah, so if someone is driven by self-destructive habits, and it's almost like ignorance is bliss. And what is it that will drive them to come out of that? That's your question. Even those who are kind of imprisoned in habits which they know are self-destructive, but in some kind of unfortunate way seem to give them some level of gratification that keeps them there. Even then, deep inside of them want to break out of that. It's just that the motivation is not there. And therefore, when one surrounds themselves with, for example, sattva, or when one surrounds themselves with people or environments or knowledge or opportunities, which then give someone a glimpse into another way of living, then that can be like almost an inducement to come out. And so anyone who's stuck in that kind of vicious circle, basically in order to break out of it, it requires an element of one of these things or multiple things to come in and to give them a glimpse of what could be outside of that. And when they get that opportunity and when they get that glimpse, then that can induce them to kind of make a shift in their life. And so according to the Bhagavad Gita, everyone has free will. And at no point is our free will taken away. However, according to the energies that cover you, ignorance, passion, and goodness, so if you imagine goodness on one side and ignorance on the other side, one's ability to exercise their free will declines as they move towards the energy of ignorance. And as one moves towards sattva, their ability to exercise their free will increases. Yet even someone in ignorance still has some free will. It may be severely reduced, but it's still there. And with that free will, if they glimpse something, then they can move on this journey and increase their free will and break out. So say, for example, a person smoking cigarettes, for example. Over the decades, the message gets louder. In the beginning, it was smoking may damage your health. Later on, it was smoking causes cancer. Later on, it was smoking kills. And it's amazing because people read this and then just smoke a cigarette. So that means that their free will is still there, but it's become severely covered. Yet such people can also break out of it. We find people break out of their habit. So it all depends on an influence outside of their current way of thinking that can glimpse them into another way of living.
Can I ask you actually?
Oh, yes.
Would that be?
Okay, sure. We can ask that. Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here with all of you. So one of the things we do many types of meditation, but I'm not quite sure what kinds of meditation you've done, but I thought today we could do a breathing meditation. Breath is, as all of you know, something which accompanies us at every step of our life. When all of our emotions change, the one thing that changes is your breath. When you're excited, when you're worried, when you're fearful, or, some emotional change comes in our life, our breath changes. And so it's not just that your emotions change your breath, but it also works the other way around. So that if we control our breath, then in some way our emotions also become stabilized somewhat. So often we just do this kind of breath control. Many of you are familiar with it. It's known as pranayama. So it's just controlling our breath, and then what we'll do is just really try to become present and really become aware and conscious of kind of every part of our body and our being. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to so please if you can come into a is it going to echo? Mine is muted. Okay. So if you can just come into sorry, how do we mute it here? And generally a lot of our attention is in our shoulders. Hold that down. Relax. more and more. Now, back. Now, bring our attention and bring us towards the top of the head. And imagine the feeling of relaxation. Spread down top of the scalp. Now, how this peaceful feeling flows into your heart. Back to your body. Back to slow motion. Body relaxed, mind also relaxed. Try to feel your core become weightless. Like lifting power. Now we will peaceful body. that um,